Thank you
So,
so much for joining us at EcoAdvance. Can you tell me what you've been doing in Corrib Beo and why you think it's important?
Corrib Beo is one of about 30 or 40 community groups, catchment groups, that has been, I suppose, encouraged to come into being, fostered by the work of Lawpro, the local authority, Water's office in Ireland. And so they brought a group of people together on a boat trip up the River Corrib from Galway in September 2018, so 5 years ago. And I was invited to go along. I just left the EPA at the time. And since then, we set up this organization, which is a voluntary non-profit company, trying to restore and promote sustainability in the catchments of the Corrib. Lough Corrib is the second largest lake in Ireland. It's a fantastic lake, 40 miles long, about 6 miles wide in places. It provides the drinking water for Galway City. Really famous for its angling, but steady decline in water quality for the last 2 or 3 decades, along with most lake systems and river systems in Ireland, and also affected by invasive species, by invasive weed and by the zebra mussels. So the group that we set up, Corrib Beo, some of the activities are in the areas of heritage and culture, because we can see that restoring a sense of identity or promoting awareness of the Corrib is a really important starting point. It's something that the public kind of relates to. It relates to a sense of something that maybe people have lost. So we've organized a lot of activities, visiting parts of the lake, going out to the islands on the lake, talking about the history of the archaeology, music festivals, bringing kids out on the lake. Another area we spent a lot of time on is education. So local education with schools in Galway. We have a group called Eco Ed for All, ecological education, and put a lot of effort into that, and are trying to promote awareness of water quality as part of, let's say, sustainability in schools. The other area then, in terms of water quality, the physical restoration work, one of the things we have learned is you need to have in your actual group access to land, so the farmers, or access to water, in other words, fishermen, fishing organizations. The fishing clubs and the Corrib have a long tradition, but they're also jealously guard their own privileges. And so we've learned that we have to work, we have to be humble, we have to basically meet them on their terms in their territory and so on. So we've ended up doing joint projects with people like that, public outreach projects, but they are really experts at restoration in terms of working with the farmers. And there's a good amount of work going on in that. But some of the challenges for us, I suppose the first challenge is really the scale of the lake. It's a very large lake. And the second challenge is working with local authorities. They're not necessarily tuned in to sitting down and working on joint programs with us. You know, bureaucrats have their own work program. And so going back to what I said, at a national level, that applies locally too. There hasn't been a forum where we can sit down and talk to either the agricultural bodies or the engineers in the county council. We need such a forum, and we are calling for that forum in the next River Basin Management Plan. And the other practical problem is just this idea of community dividend or community enthusiasm. It lasts a certain period of time, but you need to have some support, some funding for the facilitators. We've seen that with all the groups around Ireland. Some of the community groups have got a certain amount of project funding, and they then are able to hire a project manager who trains up the volunteers. That's great, but it's not consistent. The scale of the funding hasn't been there. So going back to, at the European level, national level, more guidance, more support for public participation is crucial in climate and water. And then that needs to lead to a local, let's say, attitude or policy. Yes, we fund this. It's as important as working with health or working with sports. This is a part of community life that we value. We're going to provide some funding for it. And there's some of the lessons we've learned, but we're at an early stage. You take 2 or 3 decades to build up this kind of, I think, local expertise and awareness. We have some really good traditions of community action in Ireland, even things like men's sheds and tidy towns and so on and so forth. So water groups can grow into that, we're at an early stage yet. And I think that the next cycle of the river basin, I'm confident it will provide more of a forum for us. But those forums, the state has to get behind it and believe in it. We'll see.
What about the competition between climate change and nature and all of these priorities that people are being, there's this directive and that directive. How do you balance them? Because in the end, many of those things end up in the lake. How do you balance the energy to move forward?
It's a really hard challenge because the Irish government, like all European or world governments, is struggling with those challenges all at the same time. And depending on which law is kind of more powerful in terms of the way it's engineered, right now, climate change, the structures for climate change globally and locally in Ireland are probably stronger. They have developed more recently and they're tougher. There's much harder targets to meet. And water, even though Water Framework has been there for 25 years now, the structures for it fall down at a local level. So what I think we need to do is to be able to, from a policy point of view, say the actions needed for water and climate and nature and Lough Corrib are very complementary. They're very similar. Is to design schemes that encourage participation at the local level for water and climate. So co-benefits, co-design, but also to encourage, I suppose, an openness on the part of the councils or the bureaucracies, an openness to learning across boundaries, to learning that the lessons from water are applicable to climate and so on. And that again is this idea of encouraging people whose job it is, facilitators, but not just facilitators for water or facilitators for climate, that those groups of people, those boundary spanners can and need to mobilize communities. A community meeting ends up many times talking about all these things together, talking about water quality and climate and nature and culture. And people don't think in those kind of separate categories. So, but bureaucracies do. They tend to think in much more formal kind of work program categories. So there's a learning that needs to go on about being open to programs, actions locally, funding schemes, facilitators that bring people with you. It's about environmental democracy or public participation. Unless people believe and people can see what's happening, they're not going to change their behaviors. Like, we're going to miss the targets on water, we're going to miss the targets on climate, largely not because the state isn't doing its job. The state is trying to invest in new wind energy, but we're going to miss the targets locally.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your help.